Hey guys, hope you had a good weekend. Looking forward to being back tomorrow so we can continue going with some of this digital age stuff. I think it's a good unit. I think it's a good way for you guys to finish out the year. You've been working hard. Thank you for that. Make sure to keep that pedal on the metal so that we can finish up strong instead of letting off. Yeah, today we're going to be creating some timelines related to the digital age, and then using that on a CER, using that for a written piece. I will get to that briefly as far as what I expect for that written piece. So I'm glad that you're accessing this video. First and foremost, you've got this timeline where you've got a bunch of different categories related to the digital age. So all you got to do is just choose one that's most interesting to you. Like you can see, we've got AI and robotics. We've got just computers in general. We've got graphics and games for those gamers out there. Memory and storage, World Wide Web and networking, pop culture. That might be a popular one. And then we've got software and programming languages. So just choose one of these. And like it says, you're going to create a timeline with at least 8 events for that category. You can use Canva or a simpler version like I'm going to show you here in a minute to be able to create that timeline. All right. So remember with timeline to be able to try to get that spacing down as far as which important 8 events we've got. And then within those 8 events to make sure that you've got the date labeled as well as the spacings between the date and what happened. Okay. So for example, I did a very simple one here. If it were to be one of the categories were to be the history of the Denver Broncos. So remember, all you got to do is just kind of create your legend as far as what all these dashes represents. So for me, a dash is 1 year. So I've got my first one, which was 1959 when the Broncos franchise was created. And then I literally just did a bunch of dashes until I got up to 1997. So I just did 1 dash per year between 1959 and 1997. And then I've got the next thing, which is when the Broncos won their first Super Bowl. So these, in my mind, are 4 of the most important events in Broncos history. Same thing what you're going to be doing as far as the most important events of your category. So that's for the first timeline. Second timeline, similar format as far as how you create the timeline. You can do Canva, or you can do the way that I did with the Broncos over here. But this is going to be related to a decade. So once you go into this link right here, you'll see that there's any decades from, I think it's the 40s. I think that might be wrong. I think it's the 40s to the 2010s. So you're going to choose any of those decades that you feel was significant for the digital age. I would do the 90s because I think that's, when the internet happened, when we had a lot of breakthroughs. But more recently, the 2000s or the 2010s, there's been a ton of stuff. But if you want to do back in the 50s or 60s, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happened there. And then you're going to be, like it says, one event from each decade, but then the decade that you feel was the most significant, you're going to make sure to have at least 3 events for that decade. So this is going to be a bigger timeline. You're going to be kind of going through the decades, just 1 event per decade, with the exception of the one, like for me, it would be the 90s. I would have 3 events in there. So you're going to do a timeline there. Okay. Considering the fact this is a short day, that might be where we end up. As long as I see people are working well, have completed part 1 and part 2, quality over quantity. If I'm going to do a spot check to be able to see how people did with that. If you guys were just screwing around, then you're expected to be able to do part 3. So I'm going to do a random, like we did last time, 4 people. We're going to check 4 people. And then depending on whether or not you guys have your part 1 and part 2, I'll excuse you from part 3. But if you're able to go into here, especially if you've got some time, we've got a similar thing that we've done in the past. This is also going to be very similar to what your final is going to be, guys. So like it says, it's going to be around 7 to 11 sentences. You're going to answer the guiding question below, which was, what was the most significant development of the digital age? And which decade was most significant. So we're talking about significance like we did on that video for 8-1, and you're going to be following this outline. So that is the culminating thing of this assignment. I would like you to do it if you have time. But again, if we've got 4, if we have at least 3 out of the 4 people that I spot check tomorrow on Tuesday that have done this, that have done the timelines. So as long as you've done part 1 and part 2, 3 out of the 4 people that I spot check, then I'm going to make it so your CER is optional. But if you don't trust that you're going to be able to get 3 out of 4 people from your class that did part 1 and part 2, I would strongly recommend that you get into part 3 and at least do your rough draft. Okay, so it's just a rough draft, or even doing the outline part to be able to have something that you can say that you put together related to this guiding question. And like it says on the outline, guys, to be able to hopefully use those outlines from part 1, those timelines from part 1 and part 2, to be able to construct your evidence. So you can definitely do some evidence related to part 1 and part 2, as well as in the historical context to be able to use 8-2 and the Common Lit article to do that historical context. All right, so that's another resource you can use where you don't necessarily need to go out and get much stuff here as far as evidence, because the evidence is all stuff that we've already done. Okay, but I'm just looking for a rough draft on here, or when I spot check, if I see that 3 out of 4 of you have done part 1 and part 2, quality over quantity, I'm going to excuse you from this. But otherwise, this is something that we need to make sure that we have done. All right, guys, good job. Thank you to the class captains, and thank you to our substitute teacher. I'll see you back here tomorrow.